Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on how to integrate carbon into procurement decision making, our deep dive workshop today. My name is Katrin Decker, Deputy Director of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. And for those of you who are maybe new to SPP, or also for those who are already with SPP for a while, let me quickly introduce what is behind SPP. SPP is the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. This is a community for you, for procurement by procurement. And we work together towards one goal, and that is making sustainable procurement the default. Our community, this community, equips, empowers, and encourages procurement to activate your power, to embed sustainable procurement practices into all global supply chains. And how are we doing it? We're doing it with the community. The community comes together to openly share your knowledge, your expertise, and to put things into action, to collaborate, to solve real-life procurement challenges. And SPP offers quite multiple engagement channels for you to do so. And one of these channels are the SPP initiatives. And I'm going to tell a bit more about the SPP initiatives and how this is connected to our session today a bit later. So today, welcome. We will dive into a session here with Luis from BRAE, who I will hand over the microphone in a second. And we will dive into the guide that we launched, a guide on how to integrate carbon into your decision-making in procurement. Luis will lead us through the key elements of the guide and provide some practical implementation advice. But above all, we would like to make this an interactive session. So please put on your camera, open your mic, ask your questions, bring in your specific questions about the how, the what, and why of integrating carbon into decision making. And we are very much looking forward to an interactive session. And with that, over to you, Luis.
Great, thank you very much. And it's a small group today, so lots of hopefully lots of interaction coming from everybody because you can't hide. So firstly, let me just introduce myself. So Lewis Howard, I'm the co-CEO of BRAE. BRAE is a strategy and innovation organisation focused on climate and nature. My background is in kind of procurement and organisational transformation. So started my career about 20 years ago now, so very much aging myself there. Working in procurement as a buyer, went through into kind of outsourcing, larger procurement projects, went from that into operating model transformation and then corporate strategy. Corporate strategy always took me back into operating model transformation, which always took me back into procurement, which is why I think procurement is such a strong organizational lever. You'll hear me use the phrase value exchange. Procurement creates a value exchange between two organizations and kind of creates the operating model. And from a sustainability perspective, obviously procurement is in the center of that. It's in the center of creating those value exchanges between two organizations and embedding sustainability into it. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So it's a sort of 50 minutes to an hour session today. We're going to start with a quick pulse check. So please don't flatline me, do take part in that and either using typing, coming on the microphone or using reactions. It's just a couple of questions to see where people are in terms of their understanding and their journey with carbon pricing. Katrin will then do a quick overview of the carbon pricing initiative. So why are we doing this? Kind of where's it come from? And what are the different approaches SPP are taking? And then I'm going to talk a little bit through where we as BRAE see carbon pricing and integrating carbon into decision making as part of a wider tool set that procurement has to embed sustainability into strategy and category management. And then I will go into kind of the depths of carbon pricing and integrating carbon into decision making. So we start by talking about a maturity framework. You'll hear me say a lot, I don't like the word maturity, but we look at where organizations are and the decisions that you're able to make. We then look at how we define the right approach to integrating carbon into decision making based on the context of your business. And then we look at how we think about the cost of carbon and how that impacts a business model or a business case. And we'll also have a bit of Q&A at the end. I will pause as we go through the session for questions. Please put questions in the chat. I'm currently presenting in presenter mode, so I can't always see what's going on. So also please feel free just to either raise your hand so I see it in the little list of photos, or come off mic and just interrupt me and start talking. I'm very comfortable with you doing that. So let's start with a pulse check. So just so we know who's here, in the chat for the call, can you just tell me your company and the sector that company works in, please? So yesterday on the call, by the way, I think we had pretty much every sector I could name: automotive, pharma, consumer, agriculture, everything. There was a big call yesterday. So we've got consulting. Hey Matt, how are you? Good. Chemicals, nice. FMCG consulting. Retail building materials. Oh, nice. Okay, so we can think of some good examples as we go through as well. So thank you for that. So thinking about a carbon price at an organizational level, and feel free to either again put it in the chat or use thumbs up, hearts, any of the emojis. Has any of these organization currently set a carbon price? So do you have a carbon price in your organization? Maybe for CapEx projects. So it can be outside of procurement, not just within procurement. Yes, for CapEx. We see that a lot. We see lots of, because it's a defined project, that it's very easy to kind of measure the inputs and outputs, and it's an easy kind of, or a more simple starting point for CapEx projects than for OpEx. It's often where organizations start. There's some really great examples of CapEx decisions being led through carbon pricing. We'll just wait for a couple of other things to pop up in the chat. I think yesterday, everybody that had used carbon pricing, by the way, had used it for CapEx. Nobody was using it for OpEx. Upstream interventions, nice. And then just one more coming through by the looks of things. And no carbon pricing yet. Okay. So with that, is anybody actually using it within procurement? So we talked about CapEx projects. Has anybody used it or tried to use it in a single procurement project of any category at all? And you can use the thumbs down, the sad face, if you don't want to type. The reactions are nice and fast as well. Planning to pilot this year. Nice. New carbon agriculture production, and have seen for travel. Actually, travel's an interesting example because if you use some of the travel platforms, I think the Amex travel platform includes carbon pricing within it. So you can actually allocate a carbon price to your travel. They can actually take or add on a cost to each of the travel bookings and aggregate that through the year and then use that for carbon removals. It's really nice. It's a really interesting model, and it's active because it shows people. And then I think this question's probably already been answered. Does anybody else have an objective to get to carbon pricing? Maybe just a thumbs up if you have an objective to get there. Okay. So I'll move us on. So Catherine, do you want to just give us a background on where the carbon pricing initiative came to, and then I can talk about the difference between this piece of work and the central carbon pricing project?
Absolutely. Thank you, Louis. So we talked already, or I mentioned already, our SPP initiatives. So what are SPP initiatives? SPP initiatives are a space for procurement professionals to come together and to collaboratively find solutions that not only are solutions for procurement challenges they face themselves or the company faces themselves, but that is a common challenge, either within an industry, a sector, or even across the procurement profession. And as I said, SPP is providing a safe and neutral space for even competitors to come together and to work on these initiatives, on these problem statements. And where SPP is also a good space for this to happen is because we can really pull together and bring together leadership behind those initiatives, to bring in a community, to mobilize the community and procurement professionals to actively engage in these initiatives, and also to bring in right partners to support this, in particular through pro bono partnerships, to make sure at the end of these initiatives something tangible is there, some outputs that are practical and that really move the needle with regards to integrating sustainability in procurement practices. And our first pilot of these SPP initiatives was the carbon pricing for procurement initiative, which was born out of a need that was brought to us by Halion. And also Bayer joined this call very quickly at the end of 2023. And in 2024, we convened over 200 procurement and sustainability professionals to work on the topic of how to integrate a carbon price into procurement decision making. And the result of this collaboration in 2024 was the carbon pricing principles. So a rough document really trying to bring together and summarize the discussions in the group and to outline some steps and guidance on if you're interested in integrating carbon into your procurement decision making, in particular in the tender process, then here are some guidance, some guidance, some principles for you to look at. And it didn't stop there. In 2025, we convened a group of company representatives who are interested or even already doing the piloting of these principles of carbon pricing in general. And they feed back their experience into the group. And we are currently working on revising the original draft carbon pricing principles to add more guidance, more information, more real life experience into this document to really make it tangible, practical for companies who really want to go down this route of integrating carbon pricing in their decision making. And this is where then this guide that Luis created for us came into the equation, because we wanted to put the whole discussion about carbon pricing into a broader context, because we know that SPP and the community that we're having is a very diverse one. Different company sizes, different realities, different locations globally. So how can we bring this topic that the carbon pricing initiative working group were very going deep into? How can we broaden this to a broader audience to make it more tangible also for people with different realities? And I'm not using maturity, for different realities of companies, to look into how carbon can be one lever to bring into the decision making and to advance on the decarbonization journey. And I think with that, over to you, Luis.
Thank you. And I like the right approach rather than maturity. Thank you. I'll end up using maturity loads later in the call. Thank you very much. So when we think about integrating carbon into decision making, as Catherine said, this is about designing a model or having a model that's for different categories in an organization that have in themselves different contexts, so different business stakeholders, different marketplaces, different capabilities within the team that are running that category, different experiences within that category. This gives us different approaches and different ways of thinking about how we integrate carbon into decision making, which could lead to carbon pricing. It could lead to carbon being a critical part of a decision process, or it could just lead to having an appreciation for carbon in the context of that category of spend or in the context of that strategy or sourcing event. But firstly, I think it's really important to think about integrating carbon into decision making as part of a wider toolkit of strategies. So it is one thing that we can do to support our procurement teams and to support our suppliers on a journey. We, BRAE, use a tool called Wayfinder, which I'll show you in a minute, which is 25 strategies to integrate into procurement. We integrate them in different ways into different procurement events, into different sourcing events, into different organizations that really think about what capabilities that organization has, where it is in its journey, what it's buying, and what the market is doing. And that looks at kind of 5 broad lever sets. One is how we define the product or service. So currently today, you'll probably build FSC certification into any forestry related products that you buy, timber, wood, corrugate, etc. So that is building a sustainability, in this case, certificate certification into your specification. We can go further than that. We can define the products and services that we buy by their carbon footprint, by their water intensity, by their impact on nature, by the production processes that are used, by the materials that are used. We can do all of these things and we can build strategies around that. When we think about how we find suppliers, we have a toolkit already in our arsenal. We have RFIs, RFPs, RFQs if you go through the full process. We have access to search organizations in innovation search. So really discover things about how we widen our lens, not just continue to work with the same suppliers, and how we introduce new suppliers to our supply base. Then really critically, how do we actually solidify that into a contract? How do we build deals that go beyond price and service? How do we build deals that have sustainability at the heart of them and treat sustainability like a commercial element within the contract? Then post-contract award, we think about consumption. So this is I always like 7 wastes as an example here. This is really thinking about how we optimize how we're consuming as an organization to reduce consumption, reduce demand, use all of those demand side levers and lead us to an inherently lower carbon footprint. And then innovate thinks about how we bring new technology, how we create competition with suppliers, how we find that new to you technology that supports decarbonisation. That's wrapped up into the model that we call Wayfinder. So this is our strategic toolkit. As I said, there are 25 strategies at play here. One of those is, see if I can write on this, integrating carbon into decision making. So strategy number 8 of all of our strategies. When we think about how we use these strategic tools, we don't suggest we use all 25 in a single project, because that is not developing a strategy. That's just kind of throwing a textbook at a problem. What we think about is, depending on the context of the category, how do we develop a strategic path using a set of levers that takes us to the outcome we need? So an example might be, we want to use integrating carbon into decision making. Actually, we have really good data that allows us to define the product or service by its carbon footprint. So we might think about using sustainable specifications alongside integrating carbon into decision making. And actually, because we've done that, we want to see carbon footprints going down over time with our suppliers, and we want to build a set of long-term incentives with suppliers. That is how we would think about integrating carbon in decision making as part of a strategy to decarbonize a category of spend or to decarbonize a product or service that we're developing. Obviously, there's a lot that sits behind this, but that's just where we see integrating carbon in decision making as part of a wider strategy set. And you can play with these strategies and build lots of different options, and integrating carbon in decision making would come into other strategic plays as well. So when we think about this as an individual lever, we always recognize that it can't just be implemented by itself. It should always be implemented with a couple of other levers to create a strategy. That being said, there's a lot of complexity in itself to integrating carbon in decision making. And we have to go back to the kind of fundamentals here of what a procurement organization is there to do. So, as I said, create a value exchange between two organizations. So if you deliver a service, then I will pay you. The first part of any value exchange in a barter context. And as we know in procurement, we then build on that with all the contractual clauses and all of the other commercial elements that we develop. But carbon can only be used as an objective and fair way of differentiating between suppliers when procurement decisions are based on reliable, comparable and verifiable data. So that's our kind of baseline. So once we've got reliable, comparable and verifiable data, that's then auditable, it's then trustworthy, it prevents us from discriminating between suppliers based on the decisions that they've made. And I think this is really important. We can't expect every organization in a category of spend to be the same, to have made the same choices about life cycle assessments or to have made the same choices about how they measure their own environmental impact. If we think about supplier diversity, which is something many organisations have been working towards over decades now, if we're thinking about what a diverse supplier is, small to medium enterprise, minority-led, that business will have different objectives and different pressures to a large multinational organisation. If we focus only on organisations that have the best data, then we're going to disenfranchise those smaller, diverse suppliers potentially. Doesn't mean they haven't made those decisions as well. But I think it's really important when we start to think about the strategy of saying procurement needs to make objective and fair decisions based on reliable, comparable and verifiable data. That's our kind of base concept as we start to run through this. So what does that really mean then in terms of assessing your organisation and saying, well, what is the right approach for me for integrating carbon? Well, there are three maturity levers that we talk about, or maturity sets that we talk about. Your internal alignment in your organization. Are your stakeholders aligned to the idea of using carbon in your decision making? If you put carbon at the heart of an RFP and made it 50% weighting in the RFP, would your stakeholder say that's a great idea, I'm fully aligned to that? Or would they say, no, it's all about price, it's all about service, and it's all about delivery. I do not want to prioritize carbon over that. That's the kind of question that we ask here about internal alignment. Capability and capacity, that's within the procurement organization. So that kind of bottom row. Is your procurement team at a category level, and potentially even your outsourced procurement organization if they're supporting these decisions as well, do they have the capability and the capacity to integrate carbon into an RFP? Capability is, do they understand the basics of, climate and nature? Do they understand what questions to ask, what categories of spend or what suppliers? Can they interrogate data received by a supplier and say, yes, that's trustworthy, no, it's not, or yes, that aligns to my expectations, or no, it doesn't? And can they treat climate data in the same way as they treat pricing or service data? If you're buying for a category of spend, you don't necessarily have the same expertise as your business stakeholders. You don't expect somebody buying infrastructure services to be able to go and set up a data center. You don't expect somebody buying corrugates to be able to design your next set of packaging. The skill set is different, but procurement does have a broad range of knowledge and understanding of categories. Sustainability has to be a similar level of how much that person understands their category, how much they understand the pricing dynamics in that category, how much they understand the economics that are at play that are driving all of the different commercial and operational forces in that category. So there has to be a level of capability. And capacity is about time. Do you have enough people who have enough time to build these extra things into their RFP processes? Or actually, are you running 1,000 tenders a year, going through a kind of a constant cycle, and you just don't have time to do anything else in a meaningful way? And then marketplace readiness. Are your suppliers capable and able to give you the information that you need in a trustworthy, transparent way? Because if they're not, you don't meet that test of reliable, verifiable and comparable data. You do need your marketplace to be at a level of maturity or a level of capability where they can provide you with the data. And actually, marketplace readiness also has a second kind of lens to it, which is, do you have the ability to ask these things of your supplier? If you're, spending £10,000 with IBM and you're asking them 400 questions about climate, they might not want to take part in your tender. But if you have that leverage with a supplier, obviously that's an extreme example, but if you have that leverage with a supplier and you have that relationship with a supplier and your business wants to be won by that supplier, then you've got a little bit more leverage as well. So marketplace readiness, can you get that information from your suppliers? I'm just going to pause for a second. Does that, especially the idea of internal alignment, does anybody face that as a challenge within their own organizations? Do you go to your business stakeholders and say, we'd love to build sustainability into this project, and you just get kind of a brick wall, even though your organization has science-based targets? I certainly see it with clients, by the way. Feel free to come on, either put into chat or come off mute if you wanted to respond. I saw a thumbs up from somebody there. So when we've surveyed thank you, Maria, another thumbs up. So when we've surveyed our clients as we deliver training and deliver other projects, what we find is about 80% of projects that can't build carbon into decision making or can't build sustainability into RFPs is actually hindered by internal stakeholders rather than by the supply base. So we have this running tally across all of our clients, and it's currently at about 80%. It's internal factors that prevent this from happening versus external factors, which I think is quite an interesting problem statement. So once we've understood our organizational maturity, or the positioning of our organization, and just to be clear why I don't like maturity, organizations make decisions about their operating model, about the size of the procurement team, about the responsibility of the procurement team, about who has decision rights, who has if you think about a RACI model, responsible, accountable, who's consulted and who's informed. That changes from organization to organization. So sometimes your internal maturity, your internal alignment is driven by an organizational operating model decision, not by the capability in your own organization. And even that capability and capacity of your procurement function, if your organization has decided not to invest in training because actually you're under huge cost pressure and what you want to do is you're going on a cost drive for the next 2 years because that's what's needed for the organization, that's a decision the organization's made. That's okay. That's an organizational decision that other people would see as maturity, but we try to be a bit kind of kinder to organizations and say you're structured in the way that you're structured. You're a global team or a regional team. That is just your organization that you're playing within. So for this strategy, we have 5 different approaches, which kind of go up that scale of capability, and those sort of organizational assessment levers, those low internal alignment, capability or capacity, or market readiness. The one that's going to hinder you is always going to be the lowest. So it's a bit of a weakest link model. It's whichever of those is lowest. So if you've got low internal alignment, carbon's not really seen as a legitimate decision-making factor. If you've got low capability and capacity, procurement teams aren't equipped to implement more advanced models. And if you've got low market readiness, you're not able to provide the data. So it's the lowest of those which really drives the strategy. But our strategies, for every strategy, you can incorporate carbon in decision making, from impact screening to impact modeling, all the way up to carbon pricing. So when we think about impact screening, this is really about understanding the likely sustainability challenges that a supplier is having. It's using your understanding of the marketplace. It's using your understanding of your locations where services are being delivered, approaches to delivering that service, or approaches to producing that product, and understanding that some things are more carbon, more water, more nature intensive than others. So you're screening your suppliers for the potential impact they have and making educated guesses or educated decisions and saying, actually, we think that this supplier group, or this suppliers in this location, or suppliers following this processing model are likely to be lower carbon impacting than others. That doesn't mean you don't include other people in your RFP, but in your decision-making process, you can say to your business stakeholders, for let's say fabric dyeing, dipping fabric into a vat of boiling dye is more carbon and more water intensive because of the waste than compression dyeing. So we know there are 2 different methods. We can screen those and we can say, if we want to make lower carbon decisions, choose this model over that model. That's the procurement input into that decision making. If we jump a couple of sets and we think about impact modeling, this is really procurement using a much wider data set and starting to say, actually, we understand all of these proxy indicators. We understand location and the carbon factor of the grid as a really big kind of determining factor over whether that supplier is going to be a high carbon or low carbon supplier. And access to renewable energy also has a big determining factor over whether a supplier is likely to be high carbon, low carbon. Again, the methods of waste management, the methods of processing materials, even your service delivery model can give you this ability to kind of define an impact model. And what that really then means is you say, okay, we can develop a location strategy where we know that if we're procuring a technology service, a data center, Northern Europe is much better in terms of the water consumption and the energy, the base carbon footprint of your grid versus Southern Europe. It's just a fact. Buying a data center in Sweden is going to be much lower carbon than buying a data center probably in Spain, or much lower water intensity at least. So we can start to build these impact models, and we can start to pull carbon into that decision process. Again, you probably don't have perfect data at this point. You probably don't have perfect data to say this supplier is definitely lower carbon than this supplier. But what you can describe is that the supplier's operating model, the likely carbon intensity of that, and you can use lots of data that you find online to support this. There's lots of great resources, and you can start to define that impact model. And we draw a line here between the kind of third stage and the fourth stage, because between 1 and 3, you're using carbon as an indicator. You're still collecting carbon data. You're probably asking, especially when you're thinking about impact modeling, quite detailed questions to your suppliers over how they handle waste, over their production methods, over potentially even if they're buying renewable energy or if they're measuring their carbon footprint. You're asking those questions, but you know there's inconsistency in the data, and you know as well that your business stakeholders might not want to make the decision on that point. So carbon is an indicator. You could put nature in the same bucket. Nature would be an indicator here, or water consumption would be an indicator here as well. When we get better quality data, and we can start to actually compare suppliers' carbon footprint. So maybe life cycle assessments exist for a portion of what you're buying, or maybe suppliers are able to tell you the amount of carbon that's associated with delivering a portion of the service. But actually, between suppliers, there's still inconsistencies. You know, people aren't following the same methods of calculation. There's maybe not a lot of transparency. You might even find that 2 suppliers are using exactly the same calculation method because they're making a judgment call. They're saying we're using, this percentage of our factory against this base carbon factor, and actually they're coming out with exactly the same answer. Or you're questioning how they've calculated those numbers. At that point, weighted scoring is really nice. You've got an RFP, you put 15% of your scoring against the information that's received in that, against the carbon footprints, against water consumption, against nature, against the methodology that a supplier has used to develop that. And that goes into your scoring process. That still gives you the ability to say, this supplier has scored lower than that supplier. However, we're going to override it because of the way that we make decisions, or we're going to negotiate with that supplier to take them on a sustainability journey and set them targets for improving their reporting, or improving their measurement, or maybe even doing something like over 3 to 5 years getting a supplier to put much better at point of consumption measurement of energy, things like that. So you can imagine with weighted scoring how you would build that strategy. And then we move on to carbon pricing. And this is the big difference here, is that with carbon pricing, because you're adding a carbon cost on top of your total cost, it becomes a much more binary measure. And this is where you really have to be sure about a supplier's measurement techniques, about the consistency of their data, about how they're allocating a carbon footprint to you versus somebody else. So in manufacturing, if you're 10% of the output of a factory, are they allocating 10% of that factory's carbon footprint to you, or are they allocating on a different means? You have to really understand how that carbon is being allocated, because if this is your primary point that you're using to make a decision, there's an awful lot of weight put on that number. There are a lot of other advantages that sit with carbon pricing. Suppliers knowing that carbon pricing exists, actually what we see typically is that they will also provide you with a slightly lower base price if they know that they have a high carbon footprint. But we have to be really clear that interrogating that supplier's price and their carbon footprint at the same time becomes critically important. So you can imagine during an RFP as well that you might start, if you're doing an RFI, with impact screening and work your way through based on the data that a supplier has. So you might choose actually to say, we're not sure about the data quality that exists, or we're not sure that we can make that differentiation, but we're going to think about screening our suppliers based on the impact. And then as you get your RFI data back, you might say, actually, we can build an impact model here. We've got the data's available to do that. So as you come into an RFP, you might decide you can build an impact model. And then when you get the final data back and you're in your last 2 or 3 suppliers, you could also use carbon pricing. So when we think about these strategies, you could have a strategy for a category. So we're going to do impact modeling for this category, or we're going to do weighted scoring for that category because of the maturity. We might not know, so we go through and we say, actually, we're going to start here and we're going to work our way through the different models as we go, and we're going to get as far as we can so that carbon is as built into that decision as it's possible to be. Or we might say, actually, for all of these products, let's say commodities, we're going to always do carbon pricing because we know that the data exists. We know that life cycle assessments exist. We know that we can kind of make perfect decisions. So in that category strategy for, let's say, agricultural commodities, lots of industry data exists. We're going to include carbon pricing in everything that we do. So again, there's decisions that organizations have to make as to how they implement this strategy. And it's not always binary. You can treat this as a journey or a progression or a test, kind of test and learn as you go through. Again, I'm just going to pause a second because we're going to next talk about how we set a carbon price and how we think about allocating numeric values to these. So firstly, kind of does that resonate? Can you see how across multiple categories you might use this in different ways? And now we've spoken about organizational maturity and then how that impacts carbon pricing. Are you able to make those connections within your own organization? Can you see examples where you might use a different approach? I'll just pause if anybody wants to come off mute or give a thumbs up or put something into the chat. So let me just talk through an example from yesterday. So we had somebody from a large real estate organization in yesterday, so I had to remember where they were from. And they were talking about how where they're buying products, they can imagine products where life cycle assessments are widely used. They can imagine where they could use carbon pricing completely across all of those products because the product's commoditized, the life cycle assessments are commoditized, and they're all of relatively high quality and also in date. And then they spoke about actually for other categories, especially services, they would want to test and learn on their way through. They'd want to see what information suppliers could give them, and they'd want to start with a more kind of screening approach. So in one organization, they quickly identified 2 different approaches you might take to carbon pricing versus impact screening. So obviously the cost of carbon, the price of carbon becomes really important as well. Selecting the right price or taking the approach, again, is very context dependent. So again, we don't have a single approach. We don't talk about one way of doing this. We say there are different options depending on what commodities you're buying, depending on what strategy your organization has towards net zero, or depending on even the geographic location that you're set in. So we think about a bit of kind of an art and science of setting a carbon price. And partly this is about understanding your organization and understanding what will resonate within your company. So if you're in a position where CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanisms, are at play, that impact one or a handful of your commodities, and that's something from a regulatory cost perspective your organization is very aware of, using that regulatory price, which is transparent to the world, consistent, very well publicized and spoken about, that's a really nice place to start because it's something that your organization understands as a risk. So, and that will be hedged against the finance. Your operating model considerations will be thinking about that regulatory price. So you then building regulatory price in as the carbon price or suggesting it as the cost of carbon makes an enormous amount of sense, and it also relates directly from a tender into your position from a compliance perspective as an organization. So regulatory price, which I think is the choice for the carbon pricing project, I think that's a really nice place to start if those things apply to your organization. You can also look at a market price. So there is a there are several different kind of market prices for carbon, depending on your location, depending on what commodities you're exposed to, and depending on the types of organizations you're trading with. Market prices might be a sensible way of thinking about a carbon footprint. Again, they're transparent. You can track cost of carbon. You can think about how it relates to your organization's geography, suppliers you're working with, etc. So again, market price, especially from a supplier's perspective, is quite helpful because it's really driven by the real world market dynamics of carbon and how carbon is traded and handled. A lot of organizations invest in carbon removals, so nature-based or technology-based carbon removals. They range from, the low tens of dollars per ton all the way up to hundreds of dollars per ton, depending on your organization's approach. If your organization has invested in and has a strategy to use carbon removals, especially if your organization is heavily exposed to hard to abate emissions, and therefore carbon removal is sort of one of the very few levers that you have as an organization, using your internal carbon removal price would make a lot of sense, because what you're really saying there is it's going to cost, let's say, $20 a ton to remove carbon. We have to pay that as an organization by X date. Therefore, that works as your internal price, because essentially that's the cost that you're going to have to pay as an organization for every additional ton of carbon that you leverage through your supply base. So a carbon removal price, it might not be transparent externally. You might have challenges with sharing that number with your suppliers if you have to do that, and in some cases organizations might round it up to the nearest $5 or $10 or whatever currency. But it will often resonate internally. If your organization has made an active decision for carbon removals, that is a known number that will resonate in your organization that you can easily use. And similar to carbon offset price as well. So we make a distinction between removals and offsets because they do something slightly different. But if your organization has an offset strategy, the average price that you pay for every verified ton of carbon removed, again, would be a good price to use for a cost of carbon because it resonates, it's already gone through a business case, senior leadership will understand it, and it's an actual cost you have to pay. That carbon removal and carbon offset prices work really well with internal budgeting as well, because somebody has to pay that money. Similarly, there's the idea of an abatement investment price. So especially if you're working through a long-term relationship with a supplier and you want them to change their operating model, change their production methods, or change their delivery model to reduce their carbon footprint, so go through a carbon abatement process, the capex invested or the opex needed amortized over time, the capex amortized or the opex per year, using that as a number is also really helpful because it's the actual cost that you or the supplier is going to incur to decarbonize. That's your cost of decarbonisation. Again, it's a real number. You can have a business case around it. It will be internally understood. And especially if you're thinking about this for CapEx projects, it's a really nice way of saying we're going to have to, I don't know, replace the HVAC system in our building. That's going to cost us £1 million, amortized over 5 years. That's your cost of decarbonising that part of your building. And then finally, several organizations have set an internal carbon price. I think commonly $100 a ton through lots of large multinationals is used as an internal carbon price. It's easy then to calculate. It's an easier number to communicate with your organization. And it just allows you to say, this is the way that we're valuing carbon as an organization. To be honest, it might even just be a kind of finger in the air number. There might not be a lot of maths gone into what that number is, but it's just kind of drawing a line in the sand and saying, for this year, this is our internal carbon price. That's a number that everybody has to budget with. And because it's internal, because you can adjust it over time, lots of organizations have a plan to raise that number year on year between now and 2030 or 2040. So you'll often see an internal carbon price starting at a base number and maybe going up by 5 to 10% year on year. Again, easily communicated within an organization. It helps you guide internal decision making, but it's not directly related to a cost or a tax or and how you're going to incur other costs within your organization. And we think this is a relatively sort of exhaustive range of how you might set a carbon price, but again, it's very organizationally context dependent. So a lot of people say to me, why do you include carbon offset price? Offsets have low credibility. Well, if an organization has chosen to offset carbon, that's an organizational decision that company's made. That is still a good place to start, even if you don't believe in the kind of the credibility of offsets. So that's where the organizational dependency comes in, and we have to think about what the starting point is, not necessarily what the end point is. And then again, when we go back to those 5 approaches, you can use this for carbon pricing, but you might also use it as an indicator for any other of those levels within the model. So those 5 approaches, you might still allocate a price to carbon as a way of comparing the potential risk or exposure that your organization has. So don't think that setting a carbon price only works for level 5 carbon pricing. Anytime you're integrating carbon into decision making, if you can quantify the carbon footprint, it's also helpful to quantify the potential cost or exposure that your organization has. So there we go. So we're going to pause again. I think that's the end of the presentation, and just take any questions, any thoughts, any comments that people have. And if you're really interested in carbon pricing, obviously please reach out to me or reach out to Katrin and Melissa, who can take you through how to get involved in the carbon pricing initiative as well.
Feel welcome to either open your mic or to also add your questions in the chat. And as you can see in the chat, I dropped a few links, not only to the guide itself, but also to the initiatives that we mentioned earlier. And if you have any comments, questions, or more input, because we also want to evolve this guide forward, please feel welcome to send those inputs to my email address. I put that in the chat too. And I see we have some action in the chat, so let's wait a minute. We can definitely share the recording of the session. We will do that on our YouTube channel, the SPP YouTube channel. In the next days, it should be available. And this is where you can also find the recordings of the other sessions. So yesterday's sessions, for example, we will put up there too. And just for your information, we will continue the conversation and sessions like this in September, on the 15th and 17th of September. So if you, after some digestion, you still have questions and would like to ask those directly to Luis, I highly recommend to register for those events and to bring those questions with you, because as we said, we really would like to have an open conversation about it. And I will post the link where you can find the registration links to those events in the chat now too.
And I've just popped my email in the chat as well, if anybody wants to reach out directly just to ask any further questions.
I can see some typing.
Are there any other questions about SPP? I know some people on here are very active with SPP, but also if you have any other questions for us, feel free to ask. There's also, for you and your colleagues, there's a session this week for those who've signed the pledge and just want to figure out how to get more active. I know Matt is online as well as one of our co-chairs of chapters. There's just lots to do, from initiatives to chapters. So you're welcome to join that session this week also.
So there's a great question. So should carbon pricing from scope 1 and 2 emissions be different from scope 3? I'm going to give a really annoying answer. It sort of depends on your organization and the context of your category. I think that I tend to find that organizations that have a carbon price or have set a carbon price for their own internal operations, so that they're scope 1 and 2, adding more complexity by adding another carbon price in is not always helpful. However, if you're exposed to a regulatory cost, or you're exposed to some other kind of cost, it might, if you're not a consumer-facing organization, so you might actually have, you're selling into B2B, you're selling to other organizations, and they're imposing carbon pricing on you. for particular commodities or particular categories of spend, another price might be more appropriate. So using a regulatory-led price, if we're exposed to a regulatory cost, makes an awful lot of sense because you're driving that directly through. So you're taking that potential risk exposure you have as an organization, quantifying the exact exposure from the regulation, and then applying that to your tender. So that's an example of where you might have set, let's say, an internal carbon price for scope 1 and 2 at $100 a ton, but you use a regulatory price for buying steel into Europe or importing steel into Europe as an example of something that would have a regulatory exposure. And also with that, if you are buying carbon removals specifically for scope 3, what you might say is, we're going to use our nature-based carbon removal cost for our scope 3, but not for our scope 1 and 2, because the scope 1 and 2 carbon price might be focused on how you move to renewable energy. It might be set around a specific transition, whereas your scope 3 transition context is slightly different. So it does depend slightly on the organization, but I can definitely see several examples where a different price for scope 3 makes sense versus scope 1 and 2. And then there's a comment about PCF data availability from suppliers. So just quickly comment on that. We have an amazing data scientist called Anastasia that works with us, who works for many years developing PCFs. And one of the things she always reminds me whenever we talk about PCFs as being sort of the ultimate way of comparing products is that when you're looking at a PCF, you do have to look at the methodology that's behind it. Because if you're still using carbon factors of all of the materials that go into a product, and you're comparing two organizations that are manufacturing in the same location, you can end up with two PCFs for very different products that follow very different manufacturing methods that are identical. And also PCFs, there are several instances where organizations have created a PCF or an LCA for their entire product set in 2015, and then haven't updated them since. And you would expect most organizations to have gone through some kind of decarbonisation between 2015 and now. So I think I really like the conversation that's happening in procurement at the moment about PCFs and LCAs. I think people becoming more aware of them is really helpful. My intrigue and my kind of critique, I guess, is always you have to really understand what's behind the PCF or what's behind the life cycle assessment, especially if they're being developed by AI. I think it's important to recognize that what AI is doing is looking at averages and carbon factors to create PCFs. So even where they exist, we just need to be questioning them, which is that procurement capability and capacity piece that I think is really important.
I see a lot of thumbs up.
Good.
Are there any further burning questions right now? I don't see any activity in the chat. I think we can wrap up, Lewis.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time this morning to listen. I really enjoy these conversations. So if anybody would like to reach out to me, please feel free. My email is in the chat, but it's lewis@brae.earth. Happy to take any questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.